Hello, welcome again. This is the fourth episode of this podcast, so we're going to be talking about the fourth episode of Westworld, the Riddle of the Sphinx. And I'm here, Brian, and then with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Kalani, again.
And we're going to just talk about this episode in depth, I'm sorry. And I guess let's just start with a synopsis. So, the story starts out with Bernard dragging... Well, it starts with James Delos, but I'm gonna go down character-wise. So, Bernard's story is Clementine drag him next to a cave in Sector 21, I believe. Wait, no, it's 22, sorry. And then, in the cave we find, Elsie, and turns out that she survived from Season 1. And then, we find out that the cave is hiding a facility that creates a memory unit, which also houses James Delos. Mm-hmm. James Delos' storyline starts out with him in a bare white room, and it's circular, and we see him in his daily activities in this room, and he gets visited by William. We then see through the course of this episode that William starts to age. We find out that James Delos is basically a host, and is repeating like the same conversation to William. And once he reaches build 149, James and William is having a confrontation about James' daughter and all like the current events that happen. They leave James Delos to his own devices and then dies by the hand of Bernard and Elsie. The Man in Black is currently still going through the park's storyline, The Door. They're traveling west through the park and they come upon a railroad construction team where the workers are using bodies as railroad ties. Men in Black and Lawrence then go to the town of Los Mundas, where on a previous storyline, the Men in Black killed Lawrence's family. As they get settled, they get ambushed by the Confederados that Teddy spared from the previous episode. Craddock, the main leader of this group of Confederados, has the town hostage so they can gather supplies and weapons to get to glory. Lawrence tells the Men in Black that there's guns in the town, and the Men in Black in turn tells Craddock the location of these guns. At the end of the encounter, the Men in Black decides to save the town after a long conversation with Craddock, and then the story moves on to Grace/Emily. Grace, we see her taken from Ghost Nation to a camp, so she wasn't killed from the previous episode, so I guess we predicted right. In this camp, we see Stubbs, and he mentions that the Ghost Nations are killing hosts but collecting humans. And the Ghost Nation mentions something about time is coming to Stubbs. Then, in the night scene, we see the humans are taken to an early host, which happens to be Akecheta. In the second episode, we see Akecheta and Angela together, so that's the character I'm mentioning. Grace escapes while Akecheta whispers, "You only live as long as the last person who remembers you." And at the end of the episode, Grace shows up and sees the Men in Black and proceeds to say, "Hi, Dad." I did that without breathing, apparently. So, I guess, from that long-winded, synopsis, let's start with some first, impressions. So what do you thought about this episode?
I really liked how they kept coming back to the story for James Delos, and it wasn't just told as in like, oh, this is his arc, alright, moving on to next story. It was like, it would basically start off with him, and then in the middle of the episode, it went back to his story, and at the end, you see kind of the end.
Kind of like result, right?
The result of what happens. And it's interesting that the way that Lisa Joy directed it made it so that there were two narratives that ended up at the same point.
Right.
It was really well shot. I really liked how it had the concept of loops. And just watching the behind the scenes of the episode, especially with how she was talking about how to, I guess, frame everything in that room.
Everything, yeah, there was like a big emphasis on circles, and I guess the idea is that the circles give like this impression of loops, and then that when we always go back to William visiting James Delos, is that they're having the same conversation. He even mentions that in the very first kind of at the very beginning of the episode, is like we're gonna have the same conversations. As that seems like pretty far fetched, you know. So
the one thing I at least want to figure out eventually when the time comes is the first James that we see actually him, or is it a version of him? Because we know that there's at least 140 different versions or trials that they've done where they've all failed. In the first one, we see William say to him, "Oh, this is just a baseline test." Mm-hmm. But the one similarity that all of them have is that they're given the piece of paper. Yeah. And we find out in the second time it goes around that paper has the script of what James normally would say. James or Jim. Yeah.
Well, there's something about the, like, those names that I want to get back to, like, towards the end, but the way I got it from, like, that very first one was probably, like, James Delos in the flesh.
That's what I was thinking as well.
Because if, these words, baseline and stuff like that, the big idea that I get from that, and, like, it's sort of creepy to me, is that was probably, like, a screenshot of James Delos in that time. And then all the stuff after that moment, that's basically when James Delos dies. Mm-hmm. So James Delos does not have any recollection of him dying. Mm. So that's something that kind of creeps me out a little bit, is that he probably survived maybe like another 3 or 5 years after that, but this is James Delos like right before death or something like that, you know?
The only thing I'm kind of questioning is that piece of paper, because mm-hmm. It's supposed to be a script, right? So if that first one is actually him, then what would that paper be?
It will probably be like something to explain what this project was gonna do to him.
Mm. I mean, I originally thought it could have been the original James, just because he mm-hmm. mentioned the baseline mm-hmm. and stuff like that. But as time has progressed, I've started to wonder, is that maybe the first version of him that we've seen, or
like maybe the first couple of versions,
or maybe it's like the exact first one, because I think he says at some point that they were saying how in the beginning he only could last 7 days before everything in terms of like his cognitive mind would just completely like get ruined.
Yeah, and they called it a cognitive plateau.
Right.
Yeah, in the series.
But they didn't know what it was back then. And mm-hmm. then it wasn't until the one right before, when William is already kind of in the same, I guess, shape as the Man in Black, that mm-hmm. we see them say that it's been 140 something trials. Yeah. And then he mentions the cognitive plateau where he can't get over it. Mm-hmm. And that version of James lasted for about 37 days.
Yeah. Or at least more, considering how much time has passed. So
I think they mention it in the episode.
Yeah.
They say it's about the extent or the amount of time that he could last before his mind went down went from 7 to 37 days, which is not that much of a change over the years.
Yeah, plus the time that the Man in Black just kind of like, let's just leave him and observe him through degradation, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, at that point, I think that time period had to have been right before the party, during it.
You think it's right before the party?
Well, maybe not right before, because Bernard, between the time that William gets in there mm-hmm. and something, ends up, that whole thing with the lab getting destroyed.
Yeah.
So I can't really say it's right before the party. I would say that it's somewhere between, like, right around where the party is mm-hmm. or when they have the corporate party versus,
when William kind of first enters the park?
Or around the time when Elsie disappears.
Oh, I can kind of see that. My personal opinion was that it was right before the Men in Black went into the park.
I don't think so.
So, you think somewhere along the lines of him trying to figure out the center of the maze, he probably took a detour to meet his father-in-law?
I want to say that it's... The only one I can think of is it has to be around the time Elsie disappeared. Mm-hmm. Just because, with the incident that happens, right?
Yeah.
It has to be that the Man in Black went to go see him, mm-hmm. and then everything happened, and then they were like, alright, we're just gonna leave him here.
Yeah.
But then Bernard has to also get in there, at least in the lab portion of it, and not open the door and kill all the scientists.
That's interesting because a lot of people that are like discussing this episode kind of in depth are like, oh, this is like the Men in Black at the beginning of season 1. You know, at the very beginning.
It could be. I mean, if he's been in the park.
Yeah, but this, I like this because this is different. You know?
I mean, the only reason why I'm theorizing it has to be around the time Elsie gets lost is because, at that time we know for sure Bernard is not in control of himself.
Right.
I mean, at some point he'll come back. It could be that there are different versions of Bernard just because of that. There's that promo picture with Charlotte and Bernard standing in the room.
It's an early trailer, right? Yeah.
With all of the different Bernards, and maybe it's just 2 different versions of him, but I feel like if that's the case, then there has to be a Bernard that's constantly working throughout the park and acting as, I guess, or not the CEO, but, you know, Ford's partner, while there is another Bernard in the park getting controlled by Ford like a puppet.
Yeah. Yeah, that would probably explain a lot of different things, because I felt like Bernard's kind of storyline in season 1 was very like encapsulating, like very like, how could Bernard really like go from point A to point B and all that stuff? Like, yeah, maybe multiple Bernards might answer that question.
I mean, it could also explain why his memories are disjointed if there are multiple versions of him having the exact same mind and not being able to process which is where.
And getting all bunched up together.
I mean, I feel like the logical explanation for Bernard not really knowing where he is the fact that his brain is damaged currently. And he needs that cortical fluid.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it would be interesting if there are more versions of him, and the reason why he can't process all of the different memories is because there's multiple versions of him. And because they're all at, like, it could be the same time, it could be different times.
Yeah.
Where everything is going on. He just can't process it as one person.
Right, yeah. So, I guess, staying on the first impressions, I thought this episode was really good. I felt like after last week's episode, we felt very lukewarm about it. And then this episode felt longer. And this was about like an hour and like 2-minute episode, and like this could have been like I think I heard from other podcasts is like this could have been a season finale.
It was that good, yeah.
Yeah. And it explained a lot, and it had a lot of different reveals that revealed a lot of things to the audience, but also there was a lot of things that held up, you know, some questions in front of you. Part of it, yes, is the James Delos guess lab rat situation. And then kind of like I still want to figure out different characters' motivations, especially we figured out that Grace is the Man in Black's daughter.
Right.
Emily. But why is Emily at the park? So I guess this is one of my first big questions. Like, what is Emily doing?
I feel like for Emily, it could be trying to understand her father. I mean, by now, it's understood that he's put a bunch of hours into the park. He's gone there constantly. He says that being in Westworld is better than being in real life.
Yeah.
Or living out in the real world in comparison. And if it was her growing up with her father, constantly going back into the park, and just blaming him for her mother's death, which is what I think he did say at some point, like, oh yeah, my daughter doesn't love me.
Right.
It could be just her trying to figure out in her head, you know, why is it that my father loves this park so much, and why did he spend more time in there than he did with my mom and me?
Right. I like that. This was just a question I wrote down, and I didn't really try to answer it on my own, but I think my notion is probably the same. Probably it's like a weird way to be like father-daughter time.
I think it's just, I mean, I guess with what we know of Grace so far, you can see that she has the same tenacity that her father does.
Right.
She literally runs away from the tribe. And then, you know, she also kind of just booked it out of Rajworld into Westworld.
Yeah, she also has the same demeanor, because, when her conversation with Stubbs, Stubbs was like, so you know you've gone to the park enough to know the language, and then she mentions like some people just ignore like the narratives. It was like something along the lines that I was like, I don't ignore the narratives there because I don't like people or something like that. Yeah. So that's the kind of like the first connection, I guess, if an audience member was like, oh, this character might be the Man in Black's daughter or William's daughter.
Another cool thing I liked is just, Grace kind of adds on to these very strong female characters in the show.
Yeah,
you already have Dolores and Maeve, who are very independent. I mean, of course, Dolores kind of starts off as this damsel in distress type thing, and then eventually she becomes Wyatt and embraces the Wyatt mindset and stuff. Of course, she becomes like a general. Yeah,
she's very revenge-minded.
Right. And then Maeve is out to look for her daughter, but she does it she thinks about her actions, I feel like.
Yeah, I feel like her agency comes from the fact that she's gonna do this regardless if you're gonna say no or you know, if you get in my way.
Right. And then Grace, from the beginning, from the beginning, you already see that she can kind of hold her own. And then in this newer episode, as she's talking to Stubbs, I think Stubbs is like, we'll try to help you get out of the park. And she's like, I'm not trying to look to get out in the first place. So it's, I think, cool to have all of these very strong female characters within Westworld. I want to see more of her in the future, and of course, now that she's with her father, we might be able to see more of her backstory and just more of her and her dad going through Westworld, trying to get out of it, maybe.
I have you say about like these strong female characters. I don't want to start bridging onto mansplaining. But there was something that was pointed out in Game of Thrones that I could apply here a little bit. There was a character in Game of Thrones who was like kind of like the mother of the Sand Snakes. I forgot her name, but her MO was always revenge and violence. You know what I mean? My thing was always like this character in the book reality, I guess, wasn't this kind of like person that wanted revenge all the time, was wanting for peace and stuff like that. But does violence equals more agency? You know what I mean? We could probably get more in depth probably later in like a season finale episode where we could talk about the whole season as a whole. But I don't know. I was kind of remembering because we didn't get a lot of Dolores in this episode. But you bringing up Dolores, I was like, okay, does violence equals agency?
I mean, in this case in particular, just to make it really short and quick so we can move on.
Yeah.
I would like to say that in terms of filmmaking, kind of. Because if you look at how film has been made with women in particular, especially in like violent films or even shows like this, it's like women are never shown getting shot.
Right.
You don't see blood come from them. You can see that in like Kill Bill if you ever decide to go watch it.
Yeah.
Audience, if you ever want to watch it.
Audience-wise, yes, please watch.
I think in a way, having violence, it's kind of like putting women and men on the same, I guess, kind of stage or pedestal. Cause women are supposed to be, I guess, depicted as being very like, you can't show blood. You can't show a woman getting shot, man. That's like fucked up and stuff like that. But the show, I think, has shown who Dolores getting shot. Like, she gets shot in her arm and the stomach.
Right.
And there's like blood pouring onto her dress and stuff. So, I mean, to some degree, I feel like it's kind of like makes it so that they're kind of balanced. I don't think all empowered women characters should have to be equated with violence, but to some degree, it could be a show of power.
I think it depends on kind of like writing, because the problem I had with Game of Thrones was like, it was kind of like a blind revenge story. Like, didn't see how, if we take this so far, like, what's the end result? That was my biggest problem about season 6. It was always like, it felt very accelerated and stuff like that. But this is not a Game of Thrones podcast. Well, this is a Westworld.
I think to quickly summarize before, I think when it comes to female empowerment or strong women characters in shows, is not necessarily the fact that they're equated to violence. I think it's more so just they have agency in their decisions. Like, they can choose to do something because of whatever they believe in.
That's a very good point, actually, yeah. Okay. So, going to our next point, so Elsie's, been alive. Elsie! We figure out Elsie is alive. Our prediction was that Elsie was probably with Ghost Nation, but that wasn't right. But we find out that she's alive. But here's my question. Is she alive because Ford wanted her alive or because Bernard wanted her alive? Let's put that question on the forefront right now.
Well, the last time we see Elsie in the first episode, or in season 1, is that she's getting taken by Bernard.
Yeah.
And then when we find her, Bernard says Ford didn't want, like, she knew too much.
Yeah.
But I think, if anything, she kind of has a very similar mindset to both Ford and Arnold, like the original person who created Westworld with Ford.
Right.
Just in that you can tell from how she acts that she trusts a lot of the hosts more than she trusts real people in general. She even says that in the show.
She also has more compassion, and we're and there's something we could point out at the very first series is that she dresses up like the host. When she puts the host to sleep, it's like more compassionate. If you remember, I think even episode 1, we saw her in a dress, like, I guess caressing Dolores or like comforting her right before she puts her to sleep. So, yeah, I do agree with that point. Like, she does have more general compassion to these hosts that probably Ford understood. Yeah.
It could also be the way that she treats them is kind of like she treats them like people. Which I think is something that they would want theoretically in Westworld, right? Because the way that Westworld is structured makes it so that you go in there thinking that they're not people. You just think of them as animatronic robots that you can fucking kill.
Exactly.
But Elsie kind of has like this very tenderness towards them. And the way that she treats them is almost as gentle and what is expected of you if you were to be talking to just someone else in real life. And if that's the case, then I feel like she would be a prime candidate to keep alive, especially for Ford.
I think if anything, Ford probably kept her alive because she probably knew a lot about what Delos wanted. And then I guess maybe, I don't know if Ford was very altruistic in that sense of trying to save her from that. But, maybe, right? Like, there's no way to disprove it, I suppose.
I feel like the way that Bernard was treating Elsie, because Bernard is the one that kind of chokes her out and kind of ties her up, leaves her with a basket with a whole bunch of bars and stuff like that.
Yeah, and a bucket.
Which she yells about, is kind of like how Clementine is right now. And they both kind of have like that very uptight, upheld body structure when they're doing it, right? Because at the time, Bernard is not really conscious of what his actions are. He's being controlled by someone else. And then I feel like to some degree, Clementine is also like that. Like, there was a reason why Bernard took her wherever she was. And then there's also a reason why Clementine took him to wherever Elsie was. Yeah. And I think it kind of just is Ford trying to, like, get them back together to be working. I mean, I guess it is kind of ironic in a way that it's right next to the lab with them, but I mean, it kind of opens up the narrative to, what's going on under everything else.
Still in episode 4 of series 2, Ford's influence, it just permeates all throughout the series.
I do find it very, like, a thought that has come to my head is, if it's the case that Ford theoretically did bring Bernard and Elsie to that one area, and the lab was right there, does that mean that Ford knew about the whole experiment with James Delos in the park?
I like how you asked that question because I think that was like the next question I was going to ask. But yeah, I think to a degree, I want to think that Ford didn't know that was happening, but kind of left. I think that's a remote facility and just left that team to do what they need to do. And then just kind of like mentally like note that in his mind that they're trying to put a person consciousness into like a host.
Because the only people that we know, because so far we know there are 2 labs. One of them is with Charlotte.
Yeah, Charlotte.
And then the other one is with the Man in Black.
Yeah.
But that only means that the Man in Black and Charlotte knew about those 2 labs before everything happened. So Bernard only knows about it because he somehow got program told to go there.
Yeah.
And then he killed all of the techs. Mm-hmm. And then what are they called? The robots?
The
drones, yeah. And then, so technically there's only really 3 people that know about it. One of them being Bernard, possibly Ford, because Ford was the one controlling him, maybe, unless we find out something else.
I would feel Ford probably understood what was going on, like, because it's like this whole Argos initiative, this whole idea that he wanted to build like kind of like a theme park for like highly advanced animatronic figures, you know? Like, he should probably got a handle on what's going on. Probably enough to send Bernard out there to print out a little pearl of a human consciousness. So, I don't know. I want to know. I want to think that he understood all the different pieces that are happening to his park, especially if it's just Westworld. If he had only control of just Westworld, he probably understood what was going on.
But I mean, then that would tie Charlotte's company with the company that the Man in Black is working for.
Mm-hmm. Which I feel like those are 2 separate companies. I want to think that they're 2 separort.
I would think so as well.
Yeah. That was like the whole project was to get a consciousness. So next question would probably be, who's the pearl for? Did he after watching this a second time, this is my 3rd time watching it. Do you have any idea who it might be for?
I want it to be Ford, but that's mainly because I want Anthony Hopkins back in the show. Like, his acting is so good. I kind of want to see it again. And
it would be interesting if it's like a young Ford.
It'd be pretty cool. I mean, I find it really sad. Also, can I just say really fast?
Go ahead.
The only time I've seen Anthony Hopkins lately is in Thor, and I want him back in the show. But, I think if he comes back as a younger, it might make for an interesting story.
Mm-hmm.
But I find the reoccurring pattern of, I guess, Ford going to children is very kind of like...
That sounds a little creepy when you say it like that.
Maybe not creepy, but I think it's kind of like, you don't hurt children.
Oh, so it's like going that angle. So if like the Man in Black already shot...
He shot the kid.
Shot a kid version of Ford.
Yeah. But I think, who has Ford kind of talked through? I mean, now that I think about it, we're not exactly sure if he talked through the little girl, or, who is it, Hector's, is it Hector?
Hector's,
no, it's not Hector.
Not Hector, I mean, Lawrence's daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I think even in the beginning of season 1, when the little girl talks to him, she mentions to him, like, the maze is not meant for you.
Right.
And then in this one, she's saying basically, like, one good deed does not clear up every single thing that you've done in your past.
It seems very Anthony Hopkins to say. But that's probably also, like, maybe her thing. But she's, like, a walking, talking Easter egg. Maybe.
I mean, she does mention and say something like, they don't remember what you did. But I don't know if she says something along the lines of, like, but I do. Or something. But I know she says that, one, the others don't remember, which kind of clues into the fact that she might remember. And then 2...
She was spared from last season, right?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
She, throughout the entire series, has been kind of like the fourth wall character break. For Westworld, at least. I mean,
or at least for the characters in Westworld.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the younger Ford, but that character's always been one to walk around. Which, it's kind of a weird thought, but like, I wonder what his parents would think now that rope or host is shot.
That's very interesting. Or maybe it's like some weird not a sadistic.
I mean, they're technically supposed to be in the park still.
Yeah, like in an area where not many hosts go through.
Right.
Or many guests go through. So... Yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, if...
I was thinking maybe if it was, if the show wanted to go, have Ford be really messed up, a younger version of William. We talked about this earlier. It's like, imagine the Man in Black William has to face another William that was kind of like the
The antithesis.
Yeah, like the William that was optimistic about the world. The William that was in love with, Dolores. You know what I mean?
I feel like he wouldn't face something like that. I think if anything, he's already starting to face things that facing decisions that he once made beforehand. Mm-hmm. In the sense that a lot of the decisions he's making in season 2 are the exact opposite of what he was doing in season 1. Yeah. I mean, his character so far, in season 1, we see him as kind of like this, he's kind of like a villain. He's constantly going into the other narratives. He plays the part of almost every single bad person you could play in every narrative. Mm-hmm. But season 2, he saved Lawrence's wife. Mm-hmm. And he's making a lot of decisions that he didn't make before.
Right.
And if anything, this is going to kind of change the topic a little bit.
Go on.
It's like Dolores and William are kind of switching roles. In a way. Right? Because
I could see that, yeah.
Because in season 1, Dolores is she's still the damsel in distress who's trying to find consciousness, but she's still a relatively good person in terms of morals. Yeah. And William is definitely not. Well, I mean, then again, if you think about it, he thinks about the game, or he thinks of Westworld as a game. So he doesn't really think of those hosts as people. He just thinks of them as just robots that he could kill. But in this newer season, because of the choices being different, mm-hmm. Dolores is much more of an antagonist than William is. In fact, William is doing a lot more to survive. And maybe it's that kind of like, when you're put into dire straits, your real personality comes out type thing. But I feel like William is much more of a good moral person in this season than he was in season 1, and Dolores is much more of an antagonist in season 2.
It makes it sound like my comment earlier that where I was like, I don't know if I want to root for Dolores anymore because she's such a bad guy anymore. Now the shoe's on the other foot, like, oh, like the Man in Black is becoming like this kind of anti-hero and stuff like that, and I'm just like, wait a minute. like the whole gender conversation, I was like, oh shit, maybe I should look back in Dolores' thing and probably give it a grain of salt. Probably.
I mean, Dolores is still she's still the same person.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of, she has 2 different programming, I guess programming's in her. Yeah, and then she has Loris, and then she has the Wyatt character that she's been playing much more nowadays. And I would want to say that it's not really that she's necessarily bad per se. It's just that their circumstances are a little bit different.
So she's like a victim of circumstance at this point?
A little bit, because I guess if we divide the two, or if we kind of divide the 2 seasons and look at William and Dolores as characters, William, or the Man in Black, is a character who goes into this park thinking that it's fake. There's no real stakes to going into the park because, of course, everything is going to die and he's going to live no matter what happens. It's just a matter of what choices that he makes. And of course, he goes from being the white hat William into the Man in Black. And that's kind of his change in mindset. And that's his understanding of what the park is. Yeah. Versus Dolores, whose understanding of the park is like, oh, I'm living this life constantly. And then with the trauma comes the loop. And then the maze. In season 2, though, because the circumstances are different and now there are actual risks, I think it could be that William is now regarding these hosts as more people
than actual just hosts.
Right. Yeah. Because, of course, they can die.
Well, that was his big comment at the very beginning of the whole series itself. It was like, the conversation of the William Man in Black talked to Ford was that this game doesn't mean anything unless these characters have 100% agency to kill and all these things. Yeah.
I think there's more consequence to his decisions now that the hosts actually might not be able to come back, and William also will not be able to come back if he dies.
So in this case, is the game that Ford created at this point, I'm led to believe it's just for him, right?
I don't think so.
Well, he did say that Boy Ford, said that earlier. It's like this game is made for you. I guess it's up in the air, but well, my point is that is the game now just kind of for William Man in Black to reflect in his life, kind of like in a weird, I guess, purgatory state.
I want to say it's more so a shift in perspective for both hosts and guests.
Okay.
The way that I kind of rationalize this is the hosts, if they do reach consciousness, do realize what and who they are as people. So they understand that they're robots. They understand that they've died multiple times. They're basically these infinite gods. And that these people that they're supposed to be hosts for, the guests, are actually really weak. Whereas guests, who in season 1 mostly would have seen them as just nothing really, they have like a invincible, well, they're not invincible technically, they can be brought back though, but they basically have these robots who are trying to kill them and they can actually die. And I think part of the game is to recognize that these hosts are just as much people as the guests are. And then to some degree it could just also be, I guess, for trying to get people to realize that these hosts have a consciousness to them as well. And maybe it'll get brought out in future episodes, who knows?
Well, going with your conversation about consciousness, so James Delos we see later, right? At the very end of that kind of loop on the 149th time that he becomes, like, I guess, a host, does he reach consciousness? There's a portion of, when I saw it a third time, is that, there was like an emphasis to always show him shaking. Like shaking his leg and everything, and I guess that's just to symbolize he's at that cognitive plateau. Did you notice that by the time we see him in like the kind of that horror situation where he's cycling backwards and everything, like he's not shaking at all. Like he has kind of like full control of his kind of like motion. Would you say he's conscious at that point? Like maybe he understands now that it's more or less a robot?
I want to think that in that case, his situation's a little bit different. I don't think you can group him up as a host. Just because he's not really a host. He's always been a person.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's probably the first instance of a host being based on a real person that has come up. Which has been, I think, a question of debate in a lot of the Westworld forums, which is like, what if hosts were based off of real people?
Well, that's basically Bernal though. Like, right? Like,
oh yeah,
he's based off of, that. Yeah.
I mean, but the only difference is we don't really know Arnold's backstory.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah. We only know that the build that, Bernard has is based off of someone else. But for, James, his mind is actually a part of the real creator of Delos. And in fact, he was probably the, I guess, guinea pig for an experiment where they were trying to make it so that humans could basically have their life, or live their forever in a robot body.
Yeah.
And I guess if you were to say that he did have like a consciousness, it could be in the sense that he, I guess understood his reality. But the cognitive plateau that they're talking about is the fact that his mind cannot accept the reality that he's in. And so I guess James's situation is a little bit different in the sense that his brain is being developed from an actual guy's memories. Like he knows everything that happened to James. Or I guess the host, James, knows everything that happened to real James who died.
Yeah. Up until that point where he was in Carlsbad, California, right?
Right. And we don't know exactly what happened there. We just know that he was there at some point. Maybe that's where he lived. And then he ended up in the room with everyone else. Yeah,
and like we're always being constantly referred to like him in this space. But the reason why I bring it up is because there was this idea that remember back in the first season, Ford says, like, suffering is a way for the host to reach consciousness. I was thinking, like, the fact that, you know, he's cutting himself, destroying things in the room is like him, and understanding, like, what happened to, his daughter, his son, and to kind of, like, his business as a whole. Like, that's his version of suffering. And him trying to cut himself, like, his face is like, at the very first time I saw that, I thought, oh, he's like cutting himself trying to figure out where's the seam of his face. Like, at what point am I not a person and I'm just a robot, right? Mm-hmm. That was my initial idea. But I thought by the time I saw the second and the third time, it was like, what if he's just like trying to cut, like, just probably feel, or probably like that's just kind of his way of dealing with the fact that he finally knows that, like, I'm a robot and there's probably no way of me to get out of here or something like that, you know?
I mean, it could very well be that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a very good thought to have
Mm-hmm.
about the situation. I do wonder if he'll live through the fire this time, though.
Probably not.
You never know. I do think that it could be that it is him reaching consciousness through, you know, suffering, and just like the amount of times that he kind of has to go through the thoughts of like, oh, my daughter's dead, my wife's dead, and my son is dead.
Yeah.
So my entire family's dead, including me, actually, now that I think about it.
Yeah. That's probably something really, like, crazy to think about. Because he first thought of that the first time. Like, not the first time, the second time William visits, right? Mm-hmm. And then I guess now it's all sinking in that even though that he's alive, the rest of his family's not alive. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So.
And it's been years since the beginning of, I guess...
Assuming it's probably like 30-something years at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been repetitive and repeated a whole bunch of times to only fail.
Yeah, to only fail. And that's kind of like the creepy... That's like the Black Mirror part of it. Just kind of like... Or Twilight Zone part of it. Where you're sitting down thinking about it, and you like kind of realize, well, like, wow, that's kind of screwed up. Like, I'm a robot, but I don't know that I'm going to be killed up 148 times. To the 149th time, I'm just gonna go crazy.
I think the thought that was really cool that I think Lisa Joy said that she wanted to kind of portray in this part of the show was that she was saying how Westworld isn't necessarily about just these hosts gaining consciousness. It's about the guests looking at these hosts and being like, I want to be like them in terms of the fact that they can live forever, they can be brought back up to life. And we don't have that ability. Once we're dead, we're dead.
That's what I was hoping that this series was going to be more about, instead of this idea. Because there was like a surface idea of like what these hosts could be. And like the surface idea was like, oh, they're going to use this as a military thing. Like, you have an army that won't die. You know what I mean? Or you have an army that you could always like, oh, if they get shot and down, you could just take them out, repair them, they're right back in action. You know what I mean? Which, it's like, as an audience member, it's like, yeah, sure, like, we could get that, you know? But I wanted to trust in, like, Lisa Joy and Jonathan Nolan to be like, let's subvert the ideas that people would probably have, like, surface level ideas of, like, oh, they're gonna use this technology for weapons. No, like, in this episode, I felt like this was more satisfying because I felt they're using these hosts as a way to try to, like, live forever. And that's what I like about this series, is like, it's subverting, audience expectations, you know?
I want to say that this whole portion of the show kind of emphasized the finality of, I guess, humans. The fact that, you know, we could die. It's a basic fear that most people have in general.
Of course, yeah.
Just the constant fear of, you know, we never know what day we might go out.
Yeah,
and, I think it's kind of sad to say, to watch, James kind of sit there and have to deal with the fact that, you know, his wife is dead, his daughter's dead, his son is dead. It's like, he's faced with the fact that these people who didn't kind of go through what he went through have just perished.
Yeah.
Versus him, who's constantly been reliving the same thing over and over in a loop. Kind of.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that makes it much more tragic in that story. And we're talking a lot about James Delos, and like to be fair, like this is a lot of kind of like a philosophical talk that we could go on and on for.
I would want to see more if possible.
Definitely want to see more. Before we end this episode, let's finish on one aspect of this episode that we haven't got on. Is Ghost Nation. So we found out that this episode, our predictions were correct. Ghost Nation, people from Ghost Nation are saving people. But it's also like, once we get answers to our questions, there's more questions. So, there's two things. It's like, what are they saying when they say, time is coming? When, one of their leaders is talking to Stubbs. And, you live as long as the last person who remembers you. So, go.
I didn't really think enough about the Ghost Nation situation, honestly. I mean, time is coming. It could be that the part where all of the hosts are tossed over. Maybe it's the Ghost Nation who did it. But technically Bernard is the one who did it, if we're going by what everyone's saying.
Right.
If anything, I feel like the Ghost Nation has always been kind of like a background character, and if anything, I'm more been thinking about Stubbs as a character versus the Ghost Nation. I guess the reason why I would say that is because when Stubbs gets whispered into like his ear, the whole thing about the whole spiel of you only live as long as someone remembers you. Just the Ghost Nation just vanished.
They did kind of like a Batman there, right?
Yeah, and the only time we've ever seen something like that happen is with Dolores when she turns around and, William's not there anymore. And so, to some degree, I find it a little bit odd, in a way, that this is happening to Stubbs.
So you're thinking Stubbs might be a
I'm not saying that he is, because it's just that the way that everything is framed for Stubbs is a little bit weird. I mean, he just ends up there on like this kind of like lake bed with all
a
of
row of like a bunch of people
who are still tied there, and he's the only one that's been let go. And all of the Ghost Nation people who took him there in the first place just completely vanished into thin air. Like,
well, I thought early in that scene, when Akecheta is talking, saying like, "I release you from this burden," I thought like, "Oh, you're relieved from your services," essentially. But like the last two Ghost Nation people, it was the guy that had the knife around his neck and Akecheta. But yeah, it's very ambiguous, I guess, and ominous just to see that, like, once he says that quote, they're gone, and I guess the only kind of connection that I have was that that I could put that is that the phrase that you live only as long as the last person who remembers you. It was the phrase that that the Man in Black says to James. That people prefer the memory of you than the actual person. Which, I don't know, maybe that means something further down the line, or maybe just for this episode, it was just kind of like a thought-provoking thing for the audience that you could live forever, but the memory of you lives forever. And it goes back to season 1 where I think Ford's at the gala event, he says that Chopin and all these famous music artists back in the day they never died, they just became music, you know what I mean? So I guess it's like a weird way that I don't know if to say that the Ghost Nation people are conscious, but I feel like they are, but they've always been that way because they feel very like ominous to me. They feel like different from the series. It's not the series itself, but like they seem like I don't know how to explain it. They seem very different from the host themselves. You know what I mean? And I don't think we saw any Ghost Nation in Body Shop and stuff like that. At least I don't think so. So I was just wondering, like, is Ghost Nation like separate from the park, and like what's their purpose in this park and stuff like that? I kind of want to figure out, all that later.
I feel like they have to have known that they're there, though, at least. In terms of like the most basic amount of information you can know about them, you have to at least know that they're existing in the park.
Yeah.
But I mean, we see with Lee Sizemore's narrative, I think he pitched it before everything happened. But he did say he did have some people that looked very similar to them beforehand. And then other than that though, I don't really recall them making any more of like the Ghost Nation characters.
Yeah, because I feel like the Ghost Nation has their own kind of like, I guess their own drives, because the feeling I get from this episode, like they've always been helping people, and we saw this in the Nirvana heart-shaped box trailer that I think Akechida finds young Logan in the park naked, right? So my idea is that they probably treat Ghost Nation probably differently, because also we also remember that as far as we know, before this episode, that Ghost Nation had their own kind of religion and belief systems. You know what I mean? Like they had like this doll that represents Body Shop, but it turned out that other hosts were like, oh, that's part of their religion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm like loosely tying things together. That's my problem with this is right now that I'm just tying everything that I could think of together.
I just don't think there's enough information.
That's a good point. At this point, I'm just like spouting speculation.
Yeah.
So speaking of speculation, so I guess we could just move on. I think at this point, I think we're very far into this right now, and I don't want to hold you back from doing anything else later. Let's just go straight into predictions. Well, what do you think next season's, not next season. Of course, yeah, this is season finale. No, I'm just kidding. Well, what do you think is going to happen in the next episode? So, we saw the preview. Heavy Shogun World. So, what are we thinking right now?
Well, we know the next episode's going to be a very, like, Shogun World centric one. And so, I think by that vein, we're gonna probably be seeing a lot more of Maeve's story as she's traveling through Shogun World to try to find her daughter with Lee Sizemore, Hector, and Armistice, and Felix and Sylvester. And then they're probably gonna. I don't think they're gonna find her daughter.
I don't think so either, but she's probably gonna get information. It looks like she gets captured to some degree. My prediction before was that she gets to the homestead, right? And then finds out that her daughter gets kidnapped by, people from Shogun World, right? That was my prediction. But from the preview so far, I feel like it just looks like that she's just gonna get captured from where they were at the mountain.
I want to think that maybe if there's any possible way that Maeve gets reunited with her daughter, I want her to be faced with the fact that her daughter doesn't remember her.
Yeah.
Because we know that Maeve takes up, the narrative of the,
Homesteader.
No. She takes up the narrative of the head lady of the brothel in Westworld.
Oh, like the mistress, yeah.
Yeah, she's the mistress, but she replaced someone else beforehand. So if the homesteader, I guess, role is still there or something that they're playing with, I would say that I think she would probably find someone in place of her. And I think it would be very interesting for Maeve to maybe end up in the position of what the Man in Black was or the Ghost Nation people were to her.
Oh.
Which is like busting through the door and there's someone trying to protect her daughter.
Yeah.
Because at this point, she does have guns and stuff like that. I think that would be a really interesting story to kind of have. Just Maeve ending up in that role, and then whoever it is that's the new mother protecting the daughter.
I never considered that, and I really like that prediction. I definitely really like that prediction. We saw a little bit of Dolores in this preview. I guess I kind of want to see Dolores, but I don't want the episode to be like a combination of like we're going back and forth from Dolores and Maeve. I kind of want to see it in the sense that I think maybe Dolores drops kind of like a big kind of philosophical kind of brick on us, and then the rest of the episode is just Shogun World.
I think, I don't know enough about Dolores right now, but I would want to say that maybe because she's still following the story into wherever it is that she's ending up in.
Right.
I mean, it's been established by a lot of the characters that, a lot of the characters are going to end up at the same place.
Mm-hmm.
So narrative-wise, you kind of assume that by some point, every single group that exists in Westworld will end up at one particular point and something will happen.
Right.
At least that's what I'm assuming at this point. So I think it's just them trying to push the narratives at the exact same time. For example, with this episode, the narrative was
very Man in Black heavy, right?
Yeah, but that's not what I was mentioning.
Okay.
It was the James Delos story,
mm-hmm.
and then the story with Bernard and who is it? Elsie. And then the way that they told it in the episode, which is kind of like more in a small, minuscule level,
mm-hmm.
is that they told bits and pieces of when they were trying to experiment on James,
mm-hmm.
and then they told bits and pieces of when Bernard was with Elsie, and they found in the end James kind of like mangled and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was two stories going at different paces, but kind of matching in the sense that they ended up at the same point. And I think that's kind of going to be how we see season 2, which is like there are various different stories, but they all end up in the exact same place.
Or like, are you saying exact same physical place, or kind of like exact kind of like narrative kind of plot line space?
I feel like it could be a physical place, because
mm-hmm.
like in this episode in particular, the physical place they ended up in was the lab.
Mm-hmm.
In the end game of season 2, I would think it might be that big place everyone's trying to get into.
Kind of like the Valley Beyond.
Maybe the lake? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are our predictions. If you have any more questions or want to debate with us, do that in the comments below. As far as we know, just please like, subscribe, hit that bell, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye bye.